On a Tuesday night, I opened our shared cloud drive to find a recipe, and instead I found a document titled Transition Plan. It had been edited 11 minutes earlier. My husband had written it. My best friend had commented on it. And halfway down page 2, under a heading that said Handling Nora, my best friend had written, "She's not smart enough to notice anything until it's already done." I read the whole thing twice. Then I made a cup of tea, sat down at my kitchen table, and started taking screenshots. Let me back up. My name is Nora Vance. I'm 37 years old. Years ago, I discovered that my husband and the woman I'd called my best friend for 16 years had been planning, in writing, in a document stored on an account I personally created and paid for, how to take my company, my house, and my life. I almost pulled it off. The reason they didn't is the whole story, and it comes down to one thing. They had spent years deciding I was the quiet one, the soft one. The one who handled the boring details, and they never once wondered what a woman who handles all the boring details actually knows. Let me tell you about them. My husband, Grant, is charming in the way that fills a room and empties a person. He's the man everyone loves at the party. I was a salesman when I met him, and he was extraordinary at it. And it took me 12 years of marriage to understand that being extraordinary at sales means being extraordinary at making someone believe a thing that isn't true while looking directly into their eyes. My best friend, Priya, I met at 19. She was my roommate, my maid of honor, the person I called at 3 a.m. when my father died. 16 years. She was godmother to nothing, because Grant and I never had children, which was its own long grief, and which Priya walked me through, holding my hand in a clinic waiting room while I cried. I want you to understand what she was to me, because otherwise the rest of this doesn't land. She wasn't a friend. She was the architecture of my adult life, and the company. This part matters most. 12 years ago, I started a business, a specialty commercial insurance brokerage, which is exactly as unglamorous as it sounds and exactly as profitable as it sounds if you're good at it. I was very good at it. I built it from a spare bedroom. And 3 years in, when it was growing faster than I could manage alone, I brought Grant in to run sales. It worked for a while. He was brilliant at the front of the room. I was brilliant at everything behind it. He closed. I underwrote, negotiated the carrier relationships, managed the finances, handled the compliance, ran the operations. The company grew to 30 employees and 8 figures of premium under management. And somewhere in those years, a story took hold, first with clients, then with our employees, then with Grant himself. The story was that Grant was the company and Nora was the back office. He was the one at the industry dinners. He was the one in the photos. I was the one at home at 11 p.m. reconciling carrier statements because someone had to, and because I'd never learned how to want the spotlight. Priya came in 5 years ago as our head of business development. Grant's idea, my best friend working with my husband in the company I built. I thought it was wonderful. I remember being so happy about it that I cried. I'm going to skip ahead because the details of how they began don't matter and I've stopped picking at them. What matters is the Tuesday night. I opened the shared drive looking for a recipe I'd saved. And there was a document I didn't recognize at the top of the recently edited list because it had been edited 11 minutes before. Transition Plan. Here is what was in it, and I want to describe it precisely because the precision is what saved me. It was not a love letter. It was a project plan, 11 pages. Grant had built it the way he built sales strategies, with headers and timelines and action items. Laid out, step by step, how he and Priya intended to leave together, and more importantly, how they intended to take the business with them. The plan had 3 phases. Phase 1, quietly transition the 12 largest client relationships into Priya's name in the CRM, so that when they left, the clients would follow. Phase 2, Grant would push for a restructuring of the company's ownership, using an argument about modernizing the equity structure to dilute me. Phase 3, this was the page that made my hands go cold. Grant would file for divorce, citing my mental deterioration and inability to function in the business. A narrative he'd been carefully seeding with our employees for 8 months by describing me as fragile lately. Overwhelmed, not really engaged. And under the heading Handling Nora, in a comment bubble with Priya's name and photo attached, my best friend of 16 years had written, "She's not smart enough to notice anything until it's already done." There's a specific thing that happens in your body when you read a sentence like that from a woman who held your hand while you cried in a clinic. I'm not going to try to describe it. I'll just tell you what I did. I made tea. I sat down. And I started taking screenshots. Because here is what Grant and Priya had failed to consider, and it is the single funniest thing about this entire story. The shared cloud account they were writing their plan on was an account I set up in 2014. I was the administrator. I paid the bill. Grant had never once, in 11 years, thought about who administered the family drive, because administering things was what Nora did while the real people did the real work. I had access to the version history. I had access to the edit log. I could see every revision, time-stamped, attributed. I could see the document being born in a hotel room in Denver during a conference I hadn't attended. And it got better, because people who believe you're not smart enough to notice anything get sloppy. The transition plan linked to other documents. Spreadsheet of the 12 target clients. A draft email to a competitor firm about bringing over a substantial book. And this was the piece that turned a betrayal into a crime. A folder of financial documents that showed Grant had already begun quietly moving company money. Not much yet. $90,000, routed through a vendor account that didn't provide any services. He was building the pipeline for a much larger transfer. Time for phase 2. I sat at my kitchen table until 4 a.m. and I did not cry. I want to be honest, the crying came later in long, ugly waves for months. But that night I didn't cry because something in me that had spent 12 years managing details had recognized this for exactly what it was. an operational problem. Nobody in the world was better at operational problems than the woman they'd both decided was the back office. So I did what I do. I built a file. Here is what I did over the next 4 months, while Grant and Priya believed I was oblivious and fragile and not really engaged. First, I said nothing. Nothing. That was the hardest thing I have ever done in my life. Sleeping beside a man who was writing a plan to have me declared mentally unfit, having lunch with a woman who'd called me stupid in writing. But I understood the arithmetic. The moment I spoke, they'd know, and they'd move faster, and I'd be fighting them in the open with no evidence and a husband already telling everyone his wife was deteriorating. My only advantage was that they thought they had all the time in the world. I let them keep writing. Second, I preserved everything properly. I didn't just screenshot. I went to a lawyer, an aggressive, precise woman named Delia Okonkwo, whose specialty is exactly this, business divorce, which is what happens when a marriage and a company end at the same time. And Delia told me something I've never forgotten. She said, "Nora, in 20 years I've learned that people who betray you almost always leave a paper trail, and the ones who leave the best trails are the ones who are certain you're too dim to read it. Your job now is not to be angry. Your job is to be a very good librarian." So I became a very good librarian. Every revision of the transition plan, captured with metadata. Every version of the client spreadsheet, showing the relationships being moved. Every one of Grant's seating conversations, which, because he was a salesman and salesmen love to talk, he conducted with employees who were loyal to me and who, when I eventually asked, remembered exactly what he'd said and were willing to write it down. Third, and this is where being the back office became a weapon, I quietly audited the company, all of it, every account, every vendor, every transfer. And what I found was that the $90,000 I'd first seen was not the whole picture. For 2 years, Grant had moved just over $340,000 out of the company through 3 shell vendors. He'd been stealing from the business we built long before the transition plan existed. The plan wasn't the beginning. The plan was the exit. Fourth, and Delia's favorite part, I read the operating agreement. The one I drafted with a good lawyer in 2013 before Grant ever joined the company. Because when I brought Grant in 3 years later, I gave him equity, but I did it through an amendment, and the amendment contained a provision I'd included for entirely unromantic reasons, on my lawyer's advice, and had never once thought about since. Any equity holder who diverted company assets or solicited company clients for a competing enterprise forfeited their equity entirely. Not diluted, forfeited. Grant had signed it in 2016 without reading it, because reading things was Nora's job. He had built his entire plan on the assumption that he could restructure the ownership. He'd never checked whether the ownership he had was conditional. It was, and he'd already triggered every condition in writing in a document I administered. Now, the confrontation. Because they gave me one and it was perfect. Grant scheduled it himself, phase 2 right on his timeline. He called a meeting, Grant, Priya, our small board of 3 outside advisors, and me to propose modernizing the equity structure. He'd prepared slides. Priya sat beside him, in a blazer I'd helped her pick out, and she looked at me with a face full of sympathy that I now understood had always been a costume. And Grant made his pitch. He talked about the company's future. He said, gently, sorrowfully, that Nora's role has changed, and that we all need to be realistic about capacity and engagement. He was, in front of 3 outside advisors, beginning the public construction of my incompetence. He finished. The room turned to me. And I said, before we vote on Grant's proposal, I'd like to hand out a document of my own. It's called the Transition Plan. Grant, you wrote it. Priya, you commented on it. I've brought copies. I watched the color leave my husband's face. Page 4, I said, sliding the copies down the table, explains that Grant intends to transition our 12 largest clients into Priya's name so that they follow when the 2 of them leave for a competitor. Page 7 is the draft email to that competitor. Page 9 outlines Grant's plan to file for divorce, citing my mental deterioration, a narrative he's been seeding with our staff for 8 months. I have 4 employees willing to attest to those conversations, in writing. And page 11 is a comment from Priya. I looked at her, at 16 years, at the woman from the clinic waiting room, in which she reassures my husband that I'm not smart enough to notice anything until it's already done. Nobody in that room moved. I did notice, I said. About 4 months ago, I've been reading everything you've written since, and while I was reading, I also audited the company. I laid the second folder on the table. For 2 years, Grant has moved $341,000 of company funds through 3 vendors that provide no services and are controlled by him. Here are the invoices. Here are the bank records. Here is the state filing showing his ownership. Grant found his voice, and it came out as a salesman's voice, warm and reasonable and reaching. Nora, let's not do this here. This is you're clearly very upset, and I think... Grant, I said, you signed the 2016 Equity Amendment, Section 9. Any equity holder who diverts company assets or solicits company clients for a competing enterprise forfeits their equity. Entirely. You did both, and you documented both, in a file stored on a cloud account I have administered since 2014 and pay for every month. You built your whole plan around restructuring your ownership. You never checked whether you still had any. Here is how it ended, and it ended completely. The board, 3 outside advisors who had walked into that room expecting a governance discussion and instead received an Evans file, did not need long. Grant's equity was forfeited under Section 9. He was removed from the company that day. Priya was terminated for cause. Her employment agreement had a solicitation clause she'd also, apparently, never read. The $341,000 became a criminal referral, because embezzlement from a company with outside advisors and audited books is not a marital dispute. Grant pled to avoid trial. He repaid it, which required selling nearly everything he had, and he's now a man with a fraud conviction attempting to work in an industry that is licensed, regulated, and extremely interested in fraud convictions. Grant's charm was his entire net worth. It doesn't survive a background check. The divorce, the one he planned to file citing my mental deterioration, I filed first, with Delia, on grounds that required no additives at all. The 11-page document he wrote made the settlement conversation extremely brief, and the clients he planned to steal. I called every one of them myself, and I told them the truth plainly. Not one left, because it turned out that the 12 largest clients of my company had spent years talking to the person who actually did the work, who returned their calls at 11 p.m., who caught the errors in their policies, who understood their businesses. They liked Grant at dinners. They trusted me with their money. Grant never understood the difference, which is, in the end, the same misunderstanding as the one in Priya's comment. Priya sent me a letter about a year later, 6 pages. She wanted me to understand how it happened, how she never meant, how Grant had, how she'd been so lost. I read the first page and stopped, not out of cruelty. I stopped because I realized I wasn't curious. 16 years of friendship had been ended by one sentence typed in a comment bubble, and the sentence hadn't been cruel, exactly. It had been dismissive. She hadn't hated me. She just genuinely believed I wasn't smart enough to notice. That's what I keep coming back to in the quiet, 2 years on. They didn't think of me as an enemy to defeat. They thought of me as a piece of the environment to be rude around. All those years I sat at home reconciling statements, while Grant charmed the room. Both of them slowly stopped seeing the woman who understood every single system the company ran on, and started seeing the back office. They wrote their plan to take my life on my drive, on my account, under my administration, and it never crossed either of their minds to ask who kept the keys. Because Nora keeps the keys. Nora has always kept the keys. They just never once thought, I wonder what she could see.